This is a history of anti-Semitism. This is a history of anti-Semitism. There is no question that it's historically accurate to say Jews have been victimized throughout the Middle Ages. The question is, are the Jews completely blameless in that victimization? And the answer to that is no, with a caveat. In other words, there is some fault with the Jews about why the Jews were victimized. However, the fault does not lie with the Jews, and I'll explain. The Babylonians conquered Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, because Hezekiah refused to pay tribute. Therefore, Babylon decided to take the country and its wealth. So that was for economic reasons. The Jews had a lot of money. They had a temple full of riches. Babylon wanted it, so Babylon took it. So the reason the Jews had the money, and therefore the effect was Babylon destroyed Eretz Yisrael. Jews returned, and Jews rebuilt themselves and had another 500 years of sovereignty. But then their king Herod made a deal with the Romans, who were conquering the world at the time, and this is about 30 BCE. And he said, I will invite you in and we'll make ourselves a vassal to Rome, or we'll pay tribute to Rome in exchange for you giving me the throne from the Hasmoneans, which he'd got. And then, about 100 years later, Rome was fed up with the religious freedom, with a religion that smacked in the face of their paganism and their idolatry, and with Jews who no longer wanted, again, to pay tribute and pay taxes, and rebelled and wanted independence. So Rome destroyed Judea. Again, the Jews caused it by rebelling, but Rome made the situation very difficult by restricting religious freedom and heavy taxation. Now let's move on through exile. 97,000 Judeans were taken as slaves at that time. And then over the next 100 years, more were taken as slaves, as there was still more rebellion going on in the land of Judea. The Jews that were taken as slaves during that time were moved into Europe. And the Romans quickly realized the Jews were very good at a few things. One, they were all literate, so they knew how to read and write. The Romans, as they were conquering Europe, needed clerks and clerics who could tally up and write things, record history, and are good with money. They also needed people who were good with lending, and that's how the Jews got into the lending business. No one forced anyone to take loans, and no one forced anyone to take loans on interest. If you borrow, don't be a deadbeat, you got to pay. But we're not there yet. That's not the reason why there was anti-Semitism. Let's fast forward to the year 1000. So now we had basically about 850 years of relative peace, where Jews were able to flourish in Europe. Imagine that. But a few major changes happened during that time. First, during the 4th century, Rome became Christian. And then a little bit later, during Charlemagne, Europe became Christian. So now we have Jews living under Christian rule. So you know that 109 countries that you fabricate? Almost every single one of them you look at is under Christian rule. So the issue is not 109 separate countries or cities, which is not, that number is well inflated. The bottom line is it's mostly to do with Christian rulership. But why? Jews and Christians actually lived in peace for a time until the year 1000. Something happened in that century, and that is an economic and agricultural revolution. From the Dark Ages, primitive ages, all of a sudden there was a revolution where there was more money. First of all, instead of living in small, tiny villages spread around, cities starting to form. Now, most people still lived in villages and towns, but their basis was still towns and cities became economic centers. Also, trade routes from Asia through Europe started to expand, and they went right through Germany. And where were the Jews living at the time? No, don't say Khuzar, and don't say Russia, and don't say Ukraine. Jews were living basically in two places, in France and in Germany. And yes, some in Spain and some in Italy still, as we spoke about before, that came up through Italy. Germany became a huge trade route for agriculture, and cities cropped up. When cities cropped up, now there were two things that happened. One, there was an ingathering of Gentiles, and now they had numbers. And number two is they created something called guilds. Now, Jews were not allowed to be part of those guilds. Jews were not allowed to be artisans. They couldn't be tradesmen. They had to be peddlers. They could be farmers, and they were allowed to lend money. When someone would borrow a lot of money that it couldn't pay back, or when a guild member felt like a Jew was stepping on his toes and impeding on his business and competing with him, he would rile up a blood libel, and he would rile up the king or prince, who would be anyway suspicious of the Jews because the Jews were not acceptance of Jesus. They were separate. They kept to themselves. And when a people do not accept your religion and keep to themselves, there's automatic human bias. That combined with economic competition caused the early Christians, in the name of Jesus, to create pogroms, especially when in 1096 the Crusades started. That leveled up the already heated blood of the Christians who were going to go attack and conquer the Muslims and free the Holy Land. So pogroms were normal on the way. Let's fund ourselves with Jewish wealth. And that happened for a couple centuries. Then the medieval ages were coming to an end, and people were getting to be a little bit more enlightened. And pogroms and blood libels and mass executions didn't taste that well. So therefore, two other things happened instead. First was expulsions. Now, what happened in Germany was that Germany was split up and fractured into many different municipalities. There was an emperor that ruled over the Holy Roman Empire. However, there was not much influence of that Holy Roman Empire, and basically every single little prince or duchy or would do its own little thing. So when one felt like the Jews or a Jew in that area was in competition with them, or didn't want to pay back a loan, or they just didn't like the Jews because problems were happening and they might as well blame someone. Let's blame the minority. Let's blame the Jews. So the Jews would be expelled. And the Jews were expelled. There were some good emperors, like Emperor Charles II and Emperor Maximilian, who was actually very good to the Jews in the Holy Roman Empire and protected the Jews and didn't expel them. The second thing that happened was the Inquisition. And the reason for the Inquisition is because there was a Reformation. All of a sudden, there was rumblings that people wanted to reform the church. And if people wanted to reform the church, we have to crack down. So what did the Christians do in the name of Jesus? They created the Inquisition in Spain. And that was also to combat, by the way, the Moors, the Arabs, the Muslims that were coming up and invading Europe. So it was both to make sure the Catholic Church held on steadfast to their people, that no one should reform, and also to stop the Muslims. The Inquisition spread to all areas that were controlled by Spain, the Netherlands, France, Italy, and it did not go into Germany, even though there was the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, was from Spain. He did not bring it into Germany. What happened is that when you actually meet Jews, you feel differently about them. Most kings, queens, princes did not ever meet Jews personally. They only heard about them from constituents, but there was a close Jew to certain emperors, and that's why it's important when Jews do have a little bit of influence in government, because when the government can see a Jew and see they're not the demons with the horns, Jews can survive. But then something else changed in the 1500s. There was the Reformation of the Church. And along with the Reformation of the Church, where now Europe was in a civil war between Catholicism and Protestantism, there was also the closed trade routes through Germany, because now the trade routes to India and the East came by sea. Now Germany and other countries in Europe had a problem. The trade routes were now closed, so now there was even more competition for goods and even more of a reason to hate and expel Jews. As Jews moved east to other parts of Europe, so those Christians who didn't have a taste yet for expelling Jews, pogroms, and mass killing, they got involved in that. And that's what happened in Ukraine. In Ukraine, between 1820 and 1920, there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pogroms where Jewish towns and villages were massacred and hundreds of thousands of Jews were killed. Then we move to the end of the 1800s. And all of a sudden, there was a huge renaissance across the globe that started in Germany, and it went through other parts of Europe also. And that was, let the Jews out of the ghetto and let's have religious tolerance. So Jews now were artisans, and they were tradesmen, and they were part of the guild, and they were part of universities, and they were in the public light. But of course, the old habits and hatreds die hard. And there was growing anti-Semitism from those who kept being more and more jealous because Jews were taking their teaching positions, and Jews were, though small, always a very small part of the population, were punching way above their belt in science, mathematics, the arts, medicine, and there were always those who were jealous and couldn't deal with it and couldn't take it. And of course, there was the Rothschilds who, from nothing, made themselves something. Now, mind you, we're not in a world that caters to the Jews, that makes the Jews more successful than anyone else. The fact that Jews punch way above their belt in terms of numbers and influence in the world, that ability is open to everybody. Everyone of every creed could do that. Definitely, for sure, the Christians could have done that. The fact that the Jews did it and took themselves out of the ghetto and made themselves something, the lazy tuchuses of the world couldn't deal with it, and anti-Semitism grew. And when there was a revolution in Russia, and when 97% of that revolution was Christian Orthodox, and a couple million people got killed and starved and put in gulags, who did they blame? The one Jewish member. Jews were about 2.5% of the total Russian population at the time. Okay? When Hitler came into power, and he was trying to help a seething Germany that was destroyed not by Jews, they were destroyed by the world, because after World War I, the world basically humiliated and stripped Germany of all its wealth and all its power as reparations for World War I. So he had to use the government to have an enemy, because what he did was he decided to overborrow and overspend and give people things to show that it looked like the economy was back. And one other way to make the economy go back is to create armed forces. And another way is to rob the Jews of all its wealth. That's why he took control of all the national banks, because he cleared out all the Jews' bank accounts. And that's why he moved them into ghettos and destroyed them, because he took all their art and all their wealth. Wealth and art, by the way, that they were able to accumulate since the 1860s to the 1930s. In that short period of time, again, punching way above their weight class. He didn't blame the Treaty of Versailles. He didn't blame the Americans, didn't blame the English, he didn't blame the French, he didn't even blame the Russians. Why? Because they were too powerful. So he blamed the Jews. And his laws cracked down against the Jews. And again, those old anti-Semitic tropes and feelings that lingered, even though people didn't understand them fully, they allowed such laws and such programs to continue to take place. To such a degree where he systematically murdered 6 million Jews during the Holocaust. And Europe in general, we're talking Poland, we're talking Ukraine, we're talking Lithuania, we're talking France, we're talking Italy. were so ingrained for about 1,000 years of anti-Semitic thought that when Hitler did it to the Jews, almost no one stood up for them. And you know what instead they said? They repeated all the blame. Oh, the Jews deserve it. And as they said the Jews deserve it, and dirty Jews and rat Jews and all the caricatures, they watched as 6 million were murdered. He used a lot of the old tropes. He hated communism, and he claimed all Jews were communists, even though that was not true. He also hated the Russians, and he took the Bolshevik Revolution as a sign and said the Jews were responsible for killing Christians in the Bolshevik Revolution. Sound familiar? Hitler came up with it first. And of course, it's all lies. But again, he needed his scapegoat, and he couldn't have a scapegoat be America, England, France, or Russia, because they were just too powerful. Here we are. And now we are in the 21st century. And there is a state called Israel. And it's a magnificent state. It's tiny. It's the size of New Jersey. But it punches way above its belt in terms of technology and medicine and innovation. So here we go. The old jealousies are back. The old hatred has returned. The tropes have regurgitated. And people who are insecure with themselves, they find their scapegoat. Because Jews are still 0.2% of the population. They only have one Jewish state. So you claim that it's Israel, but you hated Jews way before Israel. You claim that it's Zionism, even though Zionism expired in 1948. You claim it's October 7, 2023, even though Jews were the ones who were attacked. You blame the Jews for a genocide, even though Jews are being the ones being attacked around the world. That's the reality. And that is anti-Semitism explained. Any questions? Let me know.